Hello and welcome back to a series of lectures on floriculture. We have so far talked about plants which are cultivated in certain selected areas and their commercial production, cultivation practices as well as their potential is determined by the climatic as well as other habitat conditions. From today onwards, we will be talking about those plants which are cultivated almost universally and which are adaptable to varied ecoedaphic as well as climatic conditions. Among these, essentially the aspect is that they have tremendous potential not only to adapt, but also to maintain their productive potential. Amongst these, dahlias, cannas and gladiolus are important not only in terms of their commercial usage, but also in terms of the ornamental value as well as potential they have. Ordinarily speaking, these plants have a nature wherein they can be maintained and sustained for as long as one desires and under varied ecoedaphic as well as habitat conditions. They are perennial in nature, that is, they survive for more than 1 year, and under these conditions they also show a potential to be shifted from one particular area to another without in any way hampering or destroying their productive potential. Out of these, today we will talk about dahlia, a plant which in terms of its age as well as its cultivation practice is essentially an introduced plant into the old world. As far as historical documents are concerned, it is claimed to be a plant which has originated in Central America and it was introduced into Europe only about 200 years ago. It is claimed that as soon as its introduction into Europe took place, not only its productive potential, but also its variability was seen to be much better than it was in the original habitat in America. It is said that initially only a roughly estimated 30 species of this particular plant, that is dahlia, were known, yet at present these 30 species have in turn resulted in production of roughly estimated 20,000 different varieties. Plant 1, that is ordinarily referred to as dahlia, having 20,000 varieties automatically shows that it has a tremendous potential not only to adapt to varied climatic conditions, but also to sustain whatever potential it has in terms of its ornamental as well as productive value. It is said that in America, especially Brazilian areas, its cultivation practice was restricted as an ornamental plant wherein it was planted and was maintained in the same habitat for as long as it survives. However, its introduction into Europe also modified not only its cultivation practices, but also modified structural as well as its productive potential. It has been seen that the introduction into Europe was fundamental in not only modifying the structural pattern of the plant, but also it modified the productive potential wherein the number of flowers per plant, the size of the flowers as well as the variation in the color of the flowers has been seen to actually dominate its productive potential. In Europe, it is claimed that as soon as it was introduced, they tried to analyze what the fundamental and basic requirements in terms of habit as well as the habitat the plant is usually adapted to. And it was seen that this is a plant wherein the preferences for those habitats were the summer, especially those periods where the flowers start developing as well as start blooming. It was seen that under those conditions it requires on an average a temperature from a minimum of 25 degrees Celsius to a maximum of 35 degrees Celsius. And during winter it was seen that it actually prefers those habitats where the frost formation or extremely cooler conditions are not dominant. However, once it was domesticated in Europe as well as subsequently introduced into Asia, it was seen that even under those extremities, that is where the temperature during winter is extremely low and even frost formation is dominant, it was seen that it can be cultivated as well as protected for as long as one desires in those areas also. This modification was primarily based on analyzing what the requirements of the plant are and what should be the method of its cultivation as well as its maintenance under specific conditions. The concept of analyzing these was based on the method of propagation of this plant. Ordinarily, it was seen that this is a plant, if actually maintained in one habitat, it every year produces a huge quantity of the rhizomatous portion, which actually acts as a propagule or the material from which it can be multiplied and propagated. It was seen that if at the end of each growing season, this rhizomatous portion was dug out, and then on the basis of the size of each portion as well as the productive potential, it was divided into segments or portions, wherein each segment or each bulbous portion had a potential to develop into an individual plant and maintain and sustain its productive potential. It is said that this concept essentially evolved in Europe and subsequently was adapted not only in Asia, but also was reintroduced to its center of origin, that is in the Central American portion. It is seen that ordinarily this plant prefers the habitats wherein soil has a potential not only to maintain as well as sustain a habit where the water retention potential is low, as well as where the soil in terms of its organic manure as well as the seepage is better than those areas where water retention potential as well as soil moisture is higher. It was seen that once we try to domesticate this plant and cultivate it as an ornamental either commercially or in domesticated habitats, it usually prefers the peripheral portions of the beds in which we ordinarily grow flowers. The major concept for this was that it actually has a potential to grow from a height of minimum 1 feet to a height of maximum 5, sometimes even 6 feet tall. And it was seen that if it was planted in the first row of a flower bed, whatever plant was planted behind that row, it had not a potential to produce as well as attain or maintain the ornamental value. Subsequently, once this domestication was finalized, they also tried to analyze if they could modify the structural pattern in terms of not only number of flowers per plant, but also the size of the plant, that is in terms of height as well as size variation in the flowers of this plant. It has been seen that ordinarily there are preference for two different types of dahlias under two different conditions. If it is to be grown as an individual plant in a bed, the preference is usually for those plants which actually retain a dwarfer size, that is where the height is from a minimum of 12 inches to a maximum of 16 or sometimes even 18 inches tall. However, if we want to cultivate it as a back row plantation in a particular bed, as you can see different types of plantations, in that case we can ordinarily see that there the preference is for cultivating it in the back rows where the size of this dahlia is much taller than the size of the other ornamentals that are grown in the front rows of that particular bed. Now, after this also was finalized, that is where the type of plantation as well as practice of cultivation was finalized, they also, Europeans especially, also tried to finalize as to what method as well as what technique is useful in maintaining as well as modifying the productive potential as well as the quality of these plants. Ordinarily, this is a plant which prefers to be transplanted or sown into the ornamental beds or on the beds of a garden in the month of either March ending or in the first week of April. This concept is essentially based on the fact that prior to April, especially in December, January and February, the temperature drops down and moisture content of the habitats in terms of either excessive rainfall or excessive snowfall sometimes is negative to the survival of this particular rhizomatous portion. This practice actually has resulted in standardizing its cultivation practice wherein the individual rhizomatous portions are actually planted in a bed either at the back of those in the form of long taller these dahlias or in rows in a dwarf form, and that plantation of a rhizomatous portion is usually carried out in the month of either March or April. In this case, if we want to plant it in the form of a single row at the back of the bed, as you can see, in that case the distance between adjacent bulbs is usually from a minimum of 12 to a maximum of 16 inches. However, if we want to plant it as a bed in the form of rows, in that case we have to usually draft or create rows, and in each row the distance between two bulbous portions is from a minimum of 9 to a maximum of 16 inches. This is primarily based on determining the productive potential in terms of not only number of flowers, but also in terms of the size as well as productive potential of this particular plant. Once it has been planted, ordinarily the first and foremost requirement is that the bed in which we sow it or in which it is to be planted should be properly dug down, and the depth of that bed, as you can see, is usually from a minimum of 9 to a maximum of 12 inches. And during the digging process, usually there is a primary requirement of adding either organic manures, usually it is cow dung manure, or sometimes we have to add certain inorganic nutrients like urea or NPK, and this essentially is added prior to sowing of these bulbous portions. Usually at this particular stage, the soil and the nutrients, either inorganic or organic, are continuously mixed together, as you can see, and they are allowed to remain as such for about a week's time. At the end of that week, these bulbs are planted, and these bulbs in turn are covered by the soil in these beds, and at this time ordinarily we normally see that irrigation is necessary. However, if the bulb has been stored properly, in that case the irrigation essentially is not required till the sprouting, that is wherein the foliage starts to come out of the soil in which the bulb has been sown. Now usually it has been seen that under normal conditions, that is where the habitat is suitable, soil is moist, soil is productive, rich in nutrients as well as organic manure, we find that it takes about a week's time when the first vegetative form, that is either the foliage or sometimes even the smaller branchlets, start coming out of the soil, as you can see, and this actually necessitates the irrigation of these beds in which these dahlias have been planted. It has been seen that irrigation usually facilitates to increase the developmental pattern, that is wherein the growth is faster, and the faster growth in turn facilitates the development of much better and productive foliage, which in turn is usually facilitating the developmental pattern of the plant. Ordinarily, if the irrigation is carried out in excess, that is where the water that has been added to the bed actually remains logged in that bed, that in turn has been seen to prove negative in not only in the developmental pattern of the plant, but also it hampers the flower development as well as the flower storage or the maintenance on the plant. It has been seen that as soon as the irrigation is provided, one should always monitor whether the soil has a potential to facilitate the seepage of the moisture to lower levels. Now this is primarily because if the bed remains waterlogged, that is where the moisture is either not getting evaporated because of the absence of sunlight, or it is not getting absorbed because of the absence of the normal texture of the soil, we find that the developmental pattern as well as the productive potential, that is number of flowers as well as quality and quantity of the flower, gets varied. Now once this vegetative phase is complete, that is there is initiation of the bud formation, as you can see again buds have started to develop. Once the bud formation gets initiated at this stage, ordinarily the digging of the soil around the basal portion of these plants, that is dahlias, is essential so that the evaporative mechanism as well as the absorptive potential of the plant gets facilitated. Usually at this stage we have a necessity to add either organic manures, or sometimes we have to add inorganic nutrients, especially NPK as well as urea, so that the developmental pattern as well as the productive potential of the dahlias gets increased. However, one must here bear in mind that if the flower buds have started to sprout, that is, the flowers have opened. At that stage, the addition of nutrients, especially inorganic nutrients like NPK and urea, actually depletes not only the productive potential but also the survival pattern of these plants. This is primarily because the absorption of nutrients in turn facilitates or increases the evaporative mechanism, which in turn decreases the survival pattern of the flowers. Once the flowers start developing and they start blooming, at that stage one has to regularly monitor the bed in terms of the requirement of irrigation as well as in terms of facilitating the mechanism wherein the evaporation of that water is taking place. Ordinarily, since the dahlias are grown in sunny conditions, it has been seen that there is a fundamental requirement of either weekly or sometimes 10-day interval irrigation. However, if the dahlias are grown in shady conditions, in that case it has been seen that excessive irrigation has a drastic effect not only in the survival pattern of the plant but also in the assurance or in the quality of the flowers as well as the number of flowers produced per plant. This is primarily because the excessive irrigation or the shady conditions are not considered to be suitable to the dahlias so that their production is sustained. Then again, once the flowers have started to sprout and they are at height or peak of their bloom, at that stage one more important requirement is that one should always try to avoid the addition of any of the materials, nutrients, organic, inorganic manures or sometimes even water to the foliage portion or sometimes by extent to the flowers, because addition of these to either the foliage or the flowers or sometimes even branchlets has been seen to drastically affect not only the survival pattern of the plant but also its productive potential. As again you can see, in some cases the foliage is changing its color, in some cases flowers have shown signs of senescence, which is because of either addition of water or sometimes the addition of the nutrients. It has been seen that if one wants to facilitate the survival of these dahlias for as long as one desires, in that case one of the fundamental requirements or primary requirements is to cut off those flowers which show a peak of senescence. Here the peak of senescence actually refers where the color of the ornamental part of the flower, that is the petallary portion, gets slightly changed and sometimes show signs of withering, that is they start drying up. It has been seen that if such flowers are cut off, the developing flowers or developed flowers have a facility to not only sustain themselves but also increase the productive potential of the plant. At present, a new concept has been started, especially in commercial industries of these ornamentals, wherein these dahlias are cut off when they are either fully open or partially open, and then they are packed in airtight polythene bags and traded as ornamental flowers at not only at national but sometimes even at international level. This is because in those poly bags or airtight polythenes, these dahlias have been seen to have a potential to sustain not only their quality in terms of color as well as in terms of shape and structure, but also have a potential to sustain their ornamental value for as long as one desires or as long as one needs. This is primarily because the larger size of the flowers as well as the color variation has seen to have tremendous commercial value, which in turn has been extensively exploited by those countries as well as producers which have a primary concern with the production of dahlias. Now, once the peak of flowering as well as the signs of senescence have been seen, ordinarily the first and foremost requirement is that one should stop the irrigation pattern at that stage. The reason for this is that if irrigation is continued when the senescence has started, it has been seen to have a drastically negative effect not only the survival pattern of the flowers but also on the survival pattern of the rhizomatous portion, which in turn facilitates the survival pattern of the plant as such. It has been seen that if irrigation is continued even after senescence, the survival pattern not only in the habitat but even after being dug out or extracted is getting hampered. This is primarily because the moisture content in turn has no commercial significance for storage of these. However, if irrigation is stopped at the signs of senescence, it has been seen that the storage potential of these rhizomatous portions is increased for as long as one desires or as long as one needs. Then after the senescence is complete, as you can see in some plants the senescence is complete, at that stage one should monitor till almost all the foliage portion, that is the leaves as well as the branches and branchlets, show signs of change of their color from the greenness first to paleness and ultimately towards the brownness. At that stage one automatically can see that the plant has completed one seasonal phase of its productive potential, but not its life cycle. Here the significance is that the senescence actually shows that there is a need of harvesting these rhizomatous portions and storing them in that particular manner wherein they can sustain whatever negativities in terms of habitat as well as temperature and other ecodynamic conditions it is cultivated in the plant is facing. Ordinarily, once the rhizomatous portions are dug out, here the first and foremost requirement is one should not in any way cut off the above ground vegetative portion. Reason for this is that if that is cut off prior to digging of the rhizomes, it has been seen again it drastically affects negatively the survival pattern of these rhizomes. Now once these rhizomes along with their above ground portion, that is the stem and branchlets, are dug out, it is usually preferred to be dried in shady conditions. The reason for this is that if we keep it under sunny conditions, in those conditions the evaporation of moisture or the water that is retained by the rhizomatous portion is so large and so excessive that the storage potential of these Dhalia rhizomes gets depleted. However, it has been seen that if we want to store it properly, in that case we have to actually store it or dry it under shady conditions, and once the plant shows complete signs of senescence, as you can see the bulbous portion is dry, foliage is dry, at that stage we have to cut off this above ground portion, that is the stem part, and then by manually, that is with the help of hands or a dry cloth, remove all the dried mud that is adhered to the rhizomatous portion, as you can see, and then try to store it under extremely favorable conditions, that is where neither the temperature nor the moisture nor the storage conditions are in any way negatively affecting the survival pattern of the rhizome, and then maintain them in these conditions till the month of April, so that in April we can resow them into the main bed into which we want to cultivate it. Ordinarily, it has been seen that this cultivation practice not only helps in maintaining the survival pattern of the plant, but also in terms of commercially multiplying from one rhizomatous portion, sometimes 3, sometimes 5, sometimes even 7, depending upon the conditions in which we cultivate it. It has been seen that whosoever tries to cultivate these Dhalias commercially, he has to actually maintain them for as long as we want and try to isolate different types, so that next day when he recultivates them, he is able to cultivate individual forms under specific conditions. In this way, ordinarily the Dhalia industry has at present become one of the most important floricultural industries, wherein the trade of not only the rhizomatous portion but flowers as well as sometimes even dried flowers has attained one of the most important parts of the floriculture. Ordinarily, the preference for this should be wherein we have habitat suitable for the plant as well as the conditions which it prefers suitable. In this way, the commercial producers or sometimes even domestic producers can maintain and commercially utilize these Dhalias as not only a source of ornamentals but also as a source of income. I hope that in future whosoever is interested will follow the pattern that I have mentioned here, so that he will not only be able to commercialize the production of Dhalias but also be able to earn something not only for himself but also those who want to actually use his Dhalias for not only domestic cultivation but also for the commercial production. I hope that in future those who are actually watching this will be able to use this information for commercial production of the Dhalia.